like to introduce myself and welcome you all to the second installment of our 225th anniversary celebration of the founding of DC Humanitini series. My name is Jay Stewart. I'm the Director of Programs at Humanities DC, an organization devoted to exploring the history and culture of the district. I'd like to start out by first thanking our hosts, Busboys and Poets, in the far back, Mr. Shalal. Thank you very much for hosting this series. I would also like to recognize members of the Board of Directors. If you all could stand or wave. I've seen a couple people in the back. Members of our Board of Directors. I'd also like to recognize our staff present tonight, starting with our Executive Director. Our Executive Director, Joy Ford Austin. You could stand, please. There you go. Our Office Administrator is Stephanie Scott. Our Director of Grants, Mr. Lewis Hicks. Our Director of Development and Communications, Ms. Diane Forbes Griffin. You could stand. And last but not least, the Director of our Digital Museum, Jasper Collier. Oh, Jasper, and finally, I forgot to mention our intern, Ms. Danielle Booz from American University. I would also like to thank our honorary committee, those of you who have agreed to be a part of this celebration during the year. The chair of the honorary committee is our mayor, Muriel Bowser, and virtually everyone on the city council, and also several prominent members of her administration. We'd like to thank them for serving as our honorary committee. I would also like to thank our sponsors. We have three, Busboys and Poets being our first sponsor, so thank you again, Mr. Shalal. Also would like to recognize DC Brow, which has contributed our raffle prize, and also A Creative DC. Thank you all for your support. I'd also like to personally welcome my family, sitting over there in the corner, Ms. Jasmine Torres and Mr. Ulysses Stewart Torres. Thank you all for coming. Okay, so let's get started. First, I want to tell you about Humanities DC, formerly known as the Humanities Council of Washington, DC. Humanities DC is an independent, nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the federal agency in charge of supporting the humanities throughout the United States. Humanities DC is an essential part of the district's efforts to provide quality humanities-related programs that preserve the history and culture of the city. This year marks the 225th anniversary of the founding of the District of Columbia. As part of the celebration of this event, starting in January and continuing monthly for the rest of the year, we're holding panel discussions of scholars and contemporary commentators to discuss the highlights of a series of 20-year time periods in the history of this great city, and to link the events of those time periods to present-day issues and concerns of district residents. Humanities DC hopes to illuminate the often overlooked local history of the nation's capital and to define aspects of a unique contemporary culture of the district. Given the cultural and economic changes taking place in this city, we believe that reflecting on what our history has to teach us about the present is both timely and important. Today, we'll discuss the topic of the District of Columbia as a national symbol and a city of neighborhoods. The time period which forms the basis for our discussion is the era between 1811 and 1831. This was a time when the federal presence slowly began to emerge out of the construction sites on the present-day Capitol Hill, around Lafayette Square near the White House, and in a handful of other locations within the 100-square-mile diamond of largely undeveloped land in the district. Then as now, DC residents had to contend with a bifurcated definition of their city, one in which the federal identity competed with the local or regional one. We look forward to an evening of conversation and celebration, not debate, about this topic. We hope that everyone's views will be respected and heard. Okay, I'd like to begin by introducing our four panelists. To my left, if you could stand, Dr. Julie Yarwood, historian at Catholic University and the author of the textbook Washington 101. Next. Peter, if you could stand. Dr. Peter Uffland, professor of history at the University of District of Columbia Community College and a Capitol Hill resident. Next to him, I'd like to introduce Scott Davis, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and also a board member of the Capitol Hill Restoration Society. And finally, Jane Fundel-Levy, the consulting curator at the George Washington University Washingtoniana Museum, and also the managing editor of Washington History Magazine. So we'll begin with a PowerPoint presentation by Julie about the history of DC between 1811 and 1831.
Thank you all for coming. When George Washington selected the site for the new capital city, the population in the area that would become the District of Columbia was small. Mostly farmland, the region featured several large estates and the minor established settlements of Georgetown and Alexandria. By 1811, however, the area's more permanent population began to grow. Some of the earliest housing developments in the city were boarding houses, local taverns, and hotels that provided short-term housing options for government workers and elected officials who were only part-year residents or considered their stay in Washington, D.C. temporary. The area around the Capitol quickly became a central location for such establishments. As the federal government gradually grew in responsibility, so did the need for permanent employees to support personnel in the city. These workers needed places to live. Small houses were built and neighborhood clusters began to emerge. Each neighborhood reflected the nature of the types of businesses and services provided by the people settling there. Not surprisingly, one of the first residential areas to develop within the new Washington city was the Capitol Hill neighborhood. This area included several distinct sections, and housing was built that ranged from ornate mansions to tenement houses. In his personal reminiscences, Dr. Samuel Busey paints a vivid portrait of this division, describing residents of one section of Capitol Hill as a collection of quiet, church-going people of high social standing, including government officials, officers in the armed forces, attorneys, and scientists. Just a few blocks away, he noted, in what he deemed an uninhabitable district, Busey characterized the residents a little differently, describing them as disorderly, drunken, and debased men, women, and children that ever afflicted any section of this entire city, residing in filthy and lodging houses that were lousy with disease. These residents participated in daily and nightly carousals that were disgusting, obscene, and unsafe. Busey's colorful descriptions illustrate the diversity found within individual neighborhoods, even in the district's early decades. The Capitol Hill neighborhood was one of the first regions of the city to develop into these distinct neighborhoods, distinguished by a broad range of socioeconomic features, and this pattern would be repeated throughout the city as it developed. As infrastructure increased and businesses were built up to support the daily functioning of the government, expansion in the city center encouraged residential growth around Washington, and new neighborhoods began to grow. This early development was threatened, though, when British troops invaded Washington, D.C. on August 24th of 1815. Following the American forces' defeat at the Battle of Bladensburg, Maryland. Many of the city's residents, military, and government officials, including President Madison, fled the city before the British troops even arrived. The British set fire to several public buildings, including the Capitol's. This is the Capitol after the top was burnt off. And the White House, which at that time was known as the Presidential Mansion. They also burned the U.S. Treasury and the Department of War building. The American military itself burned much of the Washington Navy Yard to prevent the British from capturing ships and ammunition stored there, and the British followed through and finished the job. These fires were extinguished the next day by a severe thunderstorm that struck the city and a tornado that spun right through the center of town. This severe weather caused the British to leave. The occupation lasted less than 26 hours. Though it did not last long, the effect of this attack was considerable. Residential areas and privately owned businesses were left largely untouched by the British, but there was significant damage to public buildings and to public morale. When President Madison re-entered Washington on September 1st, he called upon the district's citizens to defend D.C., claiming that part of the reason it was so easy for the British to arrive and take over was that all of the residents had fled. What he didn't think about was that he was one of them. A special session of Congress convened several days later, on September 19th, One of the bills introduced recommended the relocation of the Capitol away from Washington to some more convenient and less dishonored place. This threat of relocation united the residents of the city of Washington. Local citizens acted quickly to help prevent this relocation. They were convinced that restoring the Capitol, rather than retreating from it, would renew the people's confidence in the young nation and in its government. Residents pledged money and labor to help rebuild Fort Washington on the Potomac, and a group of individual wealthy citizens financed the construction of a large brick building on the site now occupied by the Supreme Court and offered it to Congress for use while the Capitol was being restored. The federal government decided to stay. Congress used this old brick Capitol from 1815 to 1819 while the Capitol building was rebuilt. President Madison and his family resided in the Octagon House for the remainder of his term. Reconstruction on the White House began in 1815 and was finished in time for President James Monroe's inauguration in 1817. By 1824, the Navy Yard was rebuilt and thriving, and the Capitol Rotunda was completed in 1827. Construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the C&O Canal, began in 1828 and wasn't completed until 1850. By its completion, the canal connected Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland. The first section opened in 1830, and it extended to Georgetown by 1831. This would eventually continue further east, connecting the existing Washington City Canal, which extended through what is now the National Mall to the foot of the Capitol building. Obviously, this 20-year period was a time of great growth and development in Washington. We start to see this temporary city become a permanent home for citizens, and we see the first time that these citizens united together to do something, to create their own identity and ask for the government to follow suit. Thank you.
My name is Scott Davis. I'd like to thank Jay and the Humanities Council for creating the first and perhaps last panel that I'll ever sit on while having a nice beverage, and which I'm really enjoying. I'll use this. I'll put that down. Priorities. I've been asked to come in and speak on a couple of fronts. One is a board member of the Capitol Hill Restoration Society, and the other is as a resident of Capitol Hill. So to talk a little bit about kind of the CHRS, Capitol Hill Restoration Society as an organization, and then also what it's like to live on the Hill as a resident now, and kind of relative to the deeper history that Julie just gave you. And Jay would ask, kind of make it personal as well. So I try to do that, and we'll have a few images to go with that. But so the Capitol Hill Restoration Society is actually one of the first historic preservation organizations in the city, and was created more than 60 years ago. 1955. That's 10 years before the Historic Preservation Act, legislation came into play in 1965, and was very instrumental in establishing the Capitol Hill Historic District. So it's got a very long legacy, and has done some great work. Proud to be on the board, and the necessity for the origin of an organization like this is there have been so many threats to our kind of the heritage and the fabric and the character of place over time, but we've also seen, because of those efforts, a lot of kind of regulations and rules and stopgaps to put into place. But advocacy and outreach is really probably the best thing that can help maintain the character of a place. And so that's a lot of what CHRS does, walking tours to get the neighborhood out. Folks convene and learn a little bit about place, meet each other. Perhaps we should have had some mimosas or screwdrivers or some kind of early morning Humanitini thing about this too. But it's really great. If you live on the Hill, please visit chrs.org. and take a look. There's a wealth of information there on the history of the neighborhood. One thing I wanted to kind of focus on that makes the Hill unique is a few weeks ago I went through this open house. This is a house on 245 12th Street, just south of Lincoln Park, and it was an estate sale due to the passing of Miss Ivy Hoffman here, graduate of Eastern High School in 1945, and she was born in this house. Her folks lived here. She was born in the house, 1927, and lived there her whole entire life until about 6 months ago. So this sense of place and rootedness of the folks who live on Capitol Hill is very, tangible. You can see folks like this. This was her kitchen. That's as modern as she ever got it. That's the kitchen sink. And all that she had was a refrigerator. There was no washer and dryer. That's the upstairs unit. And there's a sink upstairs. I guess it's for doing laundry, perhaps, because you would hang your laundry out, maybe out in the back in the sleeping porch. But sink, you would never see I never thought about a sink in an upstairs bedroom. However, it's still there. This is the map. This is a personal thing of my wedding invitation. I got married a few years ago, but I really enjoyed focusing on. This is a kind of overlay of the map that Julie showed you, where I could have everything: a rehearsal dinner, the wedding reception, my house. Everything could all be in Capitol Hill, and everything that everybody went to existed. A few 100 years ago. And so it was really great to have kind of a neighborhood-oriented wedding, but also something with a sense of history. The only thing that we had to leave the neighborhood for is to get married over at the church, over at Church of the Epiphany. So just to show you my life now, this is my walk to work. Beautiful. This is my walk home from work. And this is what my house looks like. That's what my backyard looks like. And that's my street. And what's great about the Hill is this is my street on every third Thursday, where somebody on our street hosts the entire street for drinks. And the whole street comes out and kind of hangs out. We have a few hours just in somebody's front yard or in their kitchen or in their backyard. And so every third Thursday, the whole street gets together and has a social hour. It's really great. This is what the street looks like on Halloween, when we get more than 1,000 trick-or-treaters, kids coming through. Our 4th of July, when we close down the street, we have kind of relay races and balloon tosses and all kinds of different games and stuff for kids. And then up in Lincoln Park, at night, when folks kind of linger up and go up there to kind of watch the fireworks, and the kids climb up on the fountain there in Lincoln Park, and it's really like they say, a small town in a big city kind of feel. The other great thing that I like about living in Capitol Hill is that I can go for a walk to a Frederick Law Olmsted designed park. Most people don't know this, but the Capitol grounds is this beautiful Olmsted Park. So is the zoo, by the way. And so you can walk down to the Capitol grounds and have this very pastoral, kind of rural feel when you're still in the heart of a city. I can walk up to Lincoln Park and still have a nice neighborhoody thing. And then also over on the side of the Anacostia, this was just last weekend, we went for a walk after the snow. And on Kingman Island, an island in the middle of the Anacostia River, a great kind of nature preserve. And so you can be in the city, but I can walk 10, 15, 20 minutes either direction and be in a very kind of, a very great kind of escape from the city. So my kind of end point is that what I love about the hill is its texture. And it's got so many textures, whether you're looking up or whether you're looking down. There's always something, something interesting and authentic to look at. Including what makes Capitol Hill great is the people. It's not just the built environment. And sometimes it's just pretty. So that's it for me.
Okay, thank you. My turn to introduce myself a little bit. I'm here to be part of this panel. I'm delighted to be in the room with all of you. When I sat down, there was a smaller crowd than when I'm now turning around. The room really filled up. This is great. I'm Jane Freundel-Levy, and I am here to talk about my experience with neighborhood organizing around history and the history of our communities. I right now am a consultant for George Washington University, as Jay told you, and at the Historical Society of Washington, where I'm one of the editors of Washington History magazine. But for the previous 13 years, I had the distinct privilege to be in charge of the DC Neighborhood Heritage Trails. How many of you have seen a neighborhood heritage trail? Yes. How many of you have walked an entire trail in order? Oh, bless you. Bless you. It's been a real journey for us in creating the Heritage Trail system. It was the idea of Kathy Smith, who I know many of you in the room here know. She came up with this idea because she started an organization called Cultural Tourism DC, and the purpose of it was to help our visitors get off the mall and into our neighborhoods. So we're back to this notion of the federal history and the local history. And at the time that Cultural Tourism DC was begun, we had 20 million visitors every year to the mall. And what did they do? They came to the mall and they went to the museums and they maybe had a tour of Capitol Hill or the White House. They bought some gifts at the tax-free stores at the Smithsonian, and they went home and they had no idea about the rest of us. And at that point, there were, by actual count, 70 museums and historic houses and cultural sites of interest to tourists off the mall that people didn't know about. So why do a heritage trail? Well, the idea back then was that a heritage trail was going to be a reason to leave the mall. We wanted the tourists to stay one more day. We wanted them to get on the metro, which at that time was exceedingly reliable and clean, and was actually, you may recall, a tourist attraction. So the idea was, okay, let's get the tourists on the metro to come and get off in our neighborhoods and have something greet them in the neighborhoods. And what we hoped they would enjoy in the neighborhood was exactly a heritage trail. So the heritage trail was meant to take the tourist into the neighborhood, give them a reason to be there. And then the other thing that we did that was real sneaky was we routed the heritage trails by the neighborhood commercial strip. Aha, so we have economic development going on so that the tourist would be walking the trail, which took a while to do if you read everything, and they get thirsty and they get hungry and they might want to stop in and get a cup of coffee or go into a shop and buy something. And we also put our Heritage Trail books, which look like this, and I'm sorry we couldn't quite get the right size, but we had free Heritage Trail books, which are still around, that were in those stores. So that was an incentive. Get into the store, very subtle, and once you're in the store, pick up your free book and maybe you'll buy something. So we wanted to bring some of the tourists' resources to the city. That's why we did this. But what I was able to do with the Heritage Trails, and the great gift to me personally with the Heritage Trails, was working with the communities to gather their history. And that history was always something that took a long time to gather. A heritage trail took about 2 years to complete. And the first part of that consisted of community meetings. And I see some people in the room here who were at our community meetings. And at those community meetings, we asked a very simple question of the people from the neighborhood. which was, stories do you want to tell a visitor? And the corollary to that is, where would you tell those stories? Because a heritage trail had a physical component to it. And it was always absolutely fascinating to watch a community come together over history. Now, what do I mean by that? Our communities came together because we would have generally 2 groups in every heritage trail meeting, which you can imagine, right? The first group consisted of people who had lived there all their lives. They were longtime residents, maybe had been there for a few generations. They had very clear notions of what the history of the neighborhood was and what the stories were they wanted to tell. The second group in the room were the newcomers. And at every first meeting, the newcomers and the longtime residents would kind of square off and look at each other. And then they would look at me and they would say the first question every time was, whose history are you going to tell? Well, we're still grappling with whose history do we tell whenever we do public history in this city, right? But with the heritage trails, I was able to say, your history. And by the end of the process, the people who were new had met the people who'd been there a long time. The people who were new ended up doing oral histories with the longtime people, and they learned from them. And the people who had been there a long time were pleased because they were able to teach what they knew, and they were able to share it and make sure it didn't get lost. So heritage trails were all about gathering the history. Often we had the first cut at recent history because people talked about their own memories. And then the rest of the time we worked on them, we did the research, we checked our facts, we did a lot of work in the books, we found photographs. This is what it was about. So to get back to our theme here and to consider what you just saw about Scott's version of Capitol Hill, we tried to capture people's versions of their communities, and we also tried to give the context, because you can't do local history in Washington without considering the federal government. We also were thinking about those tourists. Now, at the end of the day, I think more people who are Washingtonians have enjoyed the heritage trails than the tourists. That's my guess. But at the end of the day, we also were thinking about how do we engage a tourist? And on a heritage trail, what that meant was not only tell the local stories of the local communities, which were very important to everybody in the room, but we also looked for something that related to national history. Either federal government history, which sometimes meant, the history of urban renewal or something that happened to really change the face of the city, or sometimes it was as simple as noting on a heritage trail that before he was president, John F. Kennedy lived in this apartment building. If you come from Iowa to look at a neighborhood in Washington, 2 things are going to happen. One is you're going to recognize the stories of the people of this community as similar to your own stories, which we felt was very important to convey. We didn't want to play into the politicians who run, quote, against Washington, unquote. Because when they run against Washington, they're not running against us, they're running against themselves. They're running against the crazy people up on the Hill who won't cooperate, right? We didn't want to play into that, but we wanted to remind people that local Washingtonian stories are American stories. And we also wanted to give, as I said, the out-of-towners something that they recognize immediately, like John F. Kennedy's apartment house. So I am here to support this conversation. I'm going to turn this over to our moderator to complete our presentations, and I look forward to discussing all of this with all of you. Thank you.
I guess I'm up last of the presenters, and I think there were some really nice segues that were created for me. Scott, I certainly hope to be doing this again, and I actually hope to be doing it with a drink in my hand, whereas you said you think that this might be the last time you'd be doing it with a drink in your hand. One of the things that Jay asked me to do, and I think it sort of brings a lot of what we've been talking here together, was to sort of talk about, as a DC transplant, which I imagine many people in this city are, and that has historically been true of this city, how my experience of living in the district has been, both as a Washingtonian and as a resident of the Capitol Hill neighborhood, but also how I feel that is or is not defined by the presence of the federal government, the presence of monumental Washington. I'm actually going to put down my drink as soon as I have a sip. So just as a little bit of background, I moved here 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, not quite. September will be 10 years. And I moved here from Chicago. I grew up in the city of Chicago, downtown. And as anybody, I'm sure, in the audience who is familiar with Chicagoans, you know, it's not something you leave easily. I often refer to myself as a Chicagoan in exile, right? And I think
White Sox.
that's not even a real question. I'm a Northsider and therefore a Cubs fan. But anyway, thank you for the question back there. You know, I think that my sense of constantly telling people that I'm in exile from Chicago, despite the fact that I clearly have lived here now for a good long time for many Washingtonians, and that I have no plans in leaving soon, is actually indicative of the experience that many people who move to the District of Columbia have, right? That there are many people who are residents of this city who, at least at the beginning, assume that their experience is going to be a temporary one. They are coming here to work for the government or for an administration, and that is something that they're going to do for a while, and therefore they're going to move home, right? And in this sense, you know, so I may live here, but I am from somewhere else. And I suppose that I hold on to this a lot, even though I'm quite happy to be a Washingtonian and really quite happy to live on Capitol Hill. It's a wonderful neighborhood. And I think in a lot of ways, this reflects sort of this dichotomy that exists between neighborhood Washington, which is very real. As a matter of fact, one of the first things that struck me about living here, I mean, almost the minute I set foot in this city, was just how much, and this is a similarity to Chicago, just how much this really was a neighborhood city, right? So as a Capitol Hill resident, how does living there, you know, and sort of looking at this as a Washington neighborhood, what does this tell us about this sort of relationship between local Washington, but also how that is defined by its presence in the shadow of, or its relation to, monumental Washington and the federal government? And I think Capitol Hill is really, in a lot of ways, a very good, a perfect example of looking at this. So I've spent my entire 10 years of living in Washington, living on Capitol Hill, or I also spent 3 years living in the Navy Yards neighborhood. We moved there in 2009 and stayed until 2012. And I think one of the interesting developments is sort of the growing relationship between what's developed in the Navy Yards and residents of Capitol Hill. It's almost like it's become their sort of a new nightlife area or neighborhood for them. So what is it like, or what defines the identity of being a resident of Capitol Hill neighborhood from somebody who is a transplant to this city? You know, I think we have to look at it clearly in two different ways. This sort of federal presence and the neighborhood presence. On the one hand, right, there is the fact that as residents of Capitol Hill, we live in the direct shadow of the Capitol and of the mall and of the Smithsonian and of the federal departments and the Senate and congressional office buildings. That's not the only part of it when you live on Capitol Hill, obviously. Many of my neighbors, many of my son's schoolmates' parents, they are high-level staffers in Congress. They are executive-level employees of departments and agencies. So this, of course, I think, starts to define what this neighborhood is, at least in the people who are living there. To put it in a more simple way, maybe, You know, when I am just relaxing at my house with neighbors, with friends, when we are having a party, when we're having Tuesday night pizza night, for example, there's a really good chance that we are going to be talking about policy or politics way more than, for example, the bar that I would normally walk into on Schubert Street in my neighborhood in Chicago. That's not going to come up. So it's pretty clear then that all of this begins to define your neighborhood as a resident of Capitol Hill. But that said, I think there's a whole nother side to Capitol Hill, and I think Scott was talking about this a lot, that really on a day-to-day basis has nothing to do with the presence of the Capitol or the agencies or the Department of Transportation or the fact that the mall is very close to us and all of these monumental aspects of Washington, D.C. For people who live on Capitol Hill, if you get up in the morning, what is a weekday morning like? Well, it's about seeing the same people and walking to school and that whole procession towards the school and knowing your neighbors and having a great sense of familiarity with them. Weekends aren't much different, right? I mean, I spend my weekends in X Park or in Turtle Park, as we call it, or Garfield Park, right? So, I mean, what is it then that defines my identity as a resident of Capitol Hill? It's greatly defined, of course, by this sort of neighborhood community of which I am a part of, right? And this doesn't just extend to, well, sort of the people that you're living with. I think a big part of what defines Capitol Hill as a neighborhood, and this is probably true of neighborhoods all over Washington, D.C., in terms of their local sense of identity, is what are the establishments that people have sort of recognized as being an important part of this community. You know, part of what makes Capitol Hill to me is knowing that I shop probably way too much at Eastern Market. And therefore, my butcher knows exactly what I'm ordering. And the people at Market lunch counter know what my breakfast order is before I say it. Or the fact that Monday night is half-price burger night at Mr. Henry's. Or the fact that my 6-year-old, I probably shouldn't admit this at all, my 6-year-old can walk into Justin's Cafe down in Navy Yards by himself, and everybody would pretty much know who he is. So, you know, it's this sense of these are our places, these are our establishments, that is a very local sense of identity that I think doesn't really have any relationship to the federal government and to monumental Washington. You know, I see this also in my students. 95% of my students, sorry, I didn't really, fill that out other than what Jay said, are residents of the District of Columbia. They have spent their entire life here. And they have a very real sense that part of what makes Washington, D.C. a great city, and part of what identifies them as Washingtonians, is the presence of the Capitol, is the presence of this sort of great, sort of architecture and the Smithsonian and all of these features of federal life. But at the same time, for my average class, I'm just sort of saying what I would expect when I ask my students, how many of you have been to the Capitol? Maybe it's 50%, right? How many of you have been to the Portrait Gallery, which happens to be one of my favorite places? My guess is that it's really about 10%. Or the Building Museum, or any place that I could pick, right? So we could look at this, and this might be a good question to discuss. Maybe the fact that my students tend to hail from wards 7 and 8 and 4 has something to do with that sort of, I don't really identify with those places, even though they recognize what makes Washington great and part of their identity is this federal presence. But at the same time, right, maybe we shouldn't be so surprised, because for them, their Washington is also the neighborhoods that they live in. And that's an identity that they have and that they're very proud of. I don't know, maybe as we were talking about earlier, what happens is that ultimately, if you live here long enough, right, you start taking the federal presence, even though it is so definitive of our city and our identity as Washingtonians, we just start taking that for granted. I don't look out my window every day, every morning anymore and say, hey, there's the Capitol. I just kind of walk past it. Or I don't walk out my door as I'm walking my son to school and say, there's that or there's that. That just becomes part of the scenery, right? So I do think that, you know, at least for Capitol Hill, and I'm assuming, I believe, for much of Washington, D.C., this is part of the great dichotomy of living in this city, that this federal presence and monumental D.C. is always going to form an important part of who we are. But so is the local nature of the communities that we live in. And on a day-to-day basis, and maybe in a more intimate sense, the people that we live with and the establishments that we share and the sort of unique idiosyncrasies of the communities that we live in, that is our local identity. And, so I think that this is probably natural for a city like this. Jay, did you want to say something?
I do. I want to thank you, Peter, for your comments. I have one comment to make to add to what Peter said, and that's that I do show my son a certain part of the federal city every time we walk past it. My son's name is Ulysses, and you all probably know that there's a statue of Ulysses Grant in front of the Capitol. Every time we walk past, I tell him that's who he's named after. Okay, we're going to take a minute to raise the screen. I would ask the panelists to take a seat on the stage, and I would like to make a couple of announcements about Humanities DC before we get started with the questions from you all. I forgot at the very beginning that we needed to make some announcements. So I'd like to start with our grants manager, Lewis Hicks, if you want to talk for a little bit about the grants program offered by Humanities DC.
Thanks, Jay. Our grant cycle is currently in process right now. We have our major and our small grants that are up for review. We are still soliciting people to solicit grants. We will review them, and right now we're basically asking you to submit what you would like to apply for funding for a small or a major grant. We also have the Soul of the City, which is a program that basically takes youth ages 14 to 19, and the grant requirements require that at least 20 students are part of the program that you develop a curriculum for. Our grant cycle will end on March 4th, so you have until basically Monday to submit a preliminary request to submit a grant, and then we will confer with you through the month of February, and then you will finalize your grant on March 4th. We also, that grant cycle will continue for a full year. It will start the beginning of May and continue until April 30th. If you have any questions, you're welcome to call me at Humanities DC, and also go to our website where you can review information. We do have a PowerPoint online where you can go through that presentation, as well as call us here in the office.
Okay, and then next, thank you, Louis. I'd next like to recognize Diane Griffin, our development director, for a minute.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to Humanitini. Hi. The reason that I am here is because I want to let you all know that this program is a free public program that we provide for the residents of Washington, D.C. to help bring old and new together in dialogue, in community, and in sharing. To provide these programs, we rely on our supporters like yourselves to give us contributions. And so what we're doing today is we have two things going on. We have a raffle where we have some swag items that have been donated by DC Brow. The raffle tickets are $5. If you would like to participate in the raffle, just come to the table and then we will award the prizes at the end of the Humanitini. The next thing that we're doing is that we have some donor cards. If you would like to come out and contribute, maybe later you want to send it in the mail, you want to do it online, or if you just want to make a pledge to give to us at a later date, you can come and pick up a donor card and take that with you, or you can fill it out here and leave it with us, and one of us will contact you later. Okay? Thank you so much.
And now, Peter, we're going to turn it over to you as our moderator. We're going to begin taking questions from the audience.
Sure. So we do have some questions that we were going to ask, but we would much rather begin by letting you guys ask any questions that you might have for anybody on the panel.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brenda Jones. I'm a native Washingtonian. I was born in the 40s. So I have been fortunate enough to have experienced a lot of the ups and downs of Washington, D.C. Basically, I've lived in a lot of the areas in the city, have a large family here in Washington, D.C., so I visit. So I wanted, listening to your story, you living on Capitol Hill, I've lived basically all in every quad of the city, but mainly east of the river. And I have to tell you, I love Southeast. I'm a Southeast person. I lived up here at 12th and U from 2000 to 2008. I'm moving from Southeast, but I had to come back to Southeast. It was my community. I have to say, though, the air is fresher, too, in Southeast. We have trees. But we had, D.C. is a wonderful place. I don't care where you are. All over this city, you'll find people who grew up here, who were born here, or even grew up here, lived here any period of time, really will tell you they love here in Washington, D.C. So to your point of different things that go on, I have very fond memories of going down to Haynes Point, and basically the whole family would go down, and we would basically sleep down there because back in the 50s, you didn't have, many of us didn't have air conditioning. So you sleep down there and let the sun wake you up. And also the same thing happened when we lived up northwest at 14th and Euclid. We would go over to, at that time, Meridian Hill Park, which is now Malcolm X Park, and we spread out our blanket out there on the park and sleep out there too all night. So we've had some really good times here in DC. Things have changed, and you know, a lot of things have changed where a lot of us didn't have control over. But I just want to let you all know that throughout this city, we've had some wonderful times. There's wonderful neighborhoods, even as of today. People who are living in different parts of this city, all over this city, are enjoying themselves. So I just wanted to say that.
Hi, my name is Robin Hamilton, and I just want to say hi to Jane. Jane is a wonderful resource of history. I'm just a big fan. All of you are, actually. Thank you for sharing your stories. I want to know, what are your thoughts, and how do you reconcile the growth of a neighborhood while preserving history? And I'm asking specifically because I'm doing research about Mary Church Terrell's house in LaDroit Park. And so some people say it's an eyesore, some people say don't touch it because it's this incredible piece of history that a lot of people don't know about. There's also a lot of development going on around there as well, just in terms of condos being built. So how do you reconcile preserving a delicate history and encouraging growth?
That sounds like a
preservation
question.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge everywhere, whether you live in a historic district or not. Even if you don't live in a historic district, it doesn't mean you don't have significant history. The history is everywhere, and the challenge is to acknowledge at one time, or on one side, that the city's changing, more people are going to move here, and we need to accommodate space for additional people. Our density will change, we need to maintain certain levels of affordability in terms of housing, and to try to strive the best we can to maintain our diversity and character to the neighborhoods. And so we need to find ways to accommodate that inevitable growth that is just going to happen. And instead of saying just no, but it's not that we refuse to grow, but it's a decision on how we grow and where and what it looks like. And so it's, it's making decisions, property by property, piece by piece, but it's evaluating the how you do it, not if you do it or to do it or not necessarily, but how do you evolve like that? Part of why I showed that image of Miss Hoffman's house, she was born in 1927, that she still had an outhouse in the back of the house. There was still the outhouse with the hole in the ground, and it was amazing that I wanted to think, well, how do we preserve not just the exterior of houses, but the interior of spaces as well. I'm worried, I'm sure maybe a developer, maybe you bought the house, they'll go in, they'll just gut it, and all of that texture, that richness of space, even though it's private space, is gone. And so there's that challenge. The challenge is that we need to ultimately kind of put our money where our mouth is, and if we believe that it's of value, we need to invest in it and figure out ways of, whether it's land trusts or other things, to try to invest in conservation, not necessarily preservation, mummification of anything that's old, but conserving heritage, conserving what's of value, and accommodating change at the same time.
Okay, that's better. Robin, thank you for those kind words. That's nice to see you again. I'm glad you brought up the Mary Church Terrell House in LaDroit Park. Do all of you know what it looks like right now? No. It's really dramatic. The house was a double house, and it has a nice pointed roof in the middle, and you could see where the house was divided into two parts, except that today there's only half of it. One half of it burned down, I think, and so there's a half of the house left, and it has been unoccupied for quite a long time. Howard University took it over, and they were going to preserve it, and so it has been fenced off, and they've been doing some minimal repairs to keep it from crumbling, but they've been trying to create a museum out of that. I have very mixed feelings about historic preservation in general. I am not doctrinaire about it. I'm a historian. So for me, I want to know the story. I want to document it. I want to have the photographs. I want to talk to people about what this place means. And if it can be preserved in a way that is useful to the community, as well as useful to the memory of the person in it, I believe that we should do that. So the issue, though, really is that we do live in a dynamic city, and as historians, those of us in the room who are, we know that the only constant is change. History is the study of change. It's not the study of what doesn't change. And our neighborhoods change all the time. So I think that what's happening in LaDroit Park around the Mary Church Terrell House is generally positive if Howard University can get its act together to fulfill its promise to create a museum to this extraordinary woman.
I just have a couple of thoughts on this. As somebody who grew up in downtown Chicago in the 1970s, Chicago looked a lot different than it does today. There were a lot of sort of bare patches there. And I think that development of the city as we know it now, or as some people know it now, Streeterville, River North, that was done without any historical considerations whatsoever. And maybe there didn't need to be as much concern for it. But I'm bringing this up because I think at the very least what we can say is that in D.C., there's going to be a lot more time taken, a lot more effort to ensure that whatever decisions are made, that historical preservation, what is and is not important in sort of preserving or allowing to grow up around it, is going to be taken into consideration. That said, I also, the only time that I didn't live sort of on Capitol Hill proper, whatever that may be, in my time here in Washington, I lived in the Navy Yards, and there is a neighborhood that has gone through rapid and radical change, right? I mean, my wife and I moved there in 2009, and it was still a neighborhood. There wasn't that much there. You go down there now, and it's starting to look like sort of Manhattan canyon alleys, and it's gonna, it's just, listen, as somebody who grew up in a downtown area, I love it. But that doesn't mean that sort of rapid transformation and radical transformation is necessarily right. So I do think that, it's really an important consideration. Other questions? I see a hand back there. God, this is great, being like the Dick Cavett of my generation. Scotch in hand.
Thank you. Good evening. Interesting panel. My name is Linda Critchlow White, native Washingtonian. My question is mainly for Jane about the cultural tourism signs, specifically those in Bloomingdale. I know some people who had grown up in Bloomingdale and helped work on the signs were concerned about some of the language on a couple of the signs where it says in the 1920s, affluent Negroes began moving into the community. And it also says that in the 1950s, when Black people were able to move out of Bloomingdale, the more affluent Negroes were able to move to other neighborhoods. The concern is the word affluent. And while it's not a bad word, definitely doesn't have a negative connotation, but some of us know that the people who were in Bloomingdale weren't really affluent. I mean, like my own grandparents purchased a house in the adjacent LeDroit Park in 1913. My grandfather was a messenger in the government. You mentioned something about the importance of documenting government. The government enabled Black people in Washington especially to have a job. It might have been a fairly menial job, but they were able to get steady employment, but it was enough to have a regular paycheck and buy a house and send their kids to college. And I don't think they would be considered affluent. And I know some of the people on the committee felt like it was kind of a slap in the face to those ordinary people in Bloomingdale and other places. So I don't know I'm wondering why you chose the word, to use the term affluent, and if it might be changed at some point.
Okay, Linda, thank you so much for your question. I think that our interpretation of the word affluent, it was meant to mean people who had means, and the means were the ability to buy property. And that was how the word is used in that heritage trail. And as we all know, all of us who are writers and editor people, we can argue till the cows come home about the nuances of specific words. If that word is a problem for the people in the community or in that neighborhood, the heritage trail book that goes with the signs has not been completed yet. So that's an opportunity to express it differently. But I'm surprised, frankly, to hear that the use of the word affluent was a problem, because, as I mentioned earlier, the Heritage Trail was a community process, and what we wrote was reviewed by all kinds of people, and I had not heard anyone complain that was inappropriate. The fact that your family included a messenger, as you well know, being a government messenger was a good, steady job, as you just described, and it allowed people to move up the economic ladder. The fact that African Americans came to Washington specifically for opportunities in the government and in order to educate their children in really good schools is well known, especially in your grandfather's or your great-grandfather's era. So if the word affluent suggests someone who's going down to city center and spending, a lot of money at Paul Stewart, then I apologize. I didn't hear it that way when I read it, but I appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cassidy. I'm a student at Georgetown. I just had a question about what you've all kind of alluded to, but I think not quite directly addressed, which is how gentrification has kind of shaped the more recent identity of the city. Dr. Yarwood was talking about how early DC had this sort of character of diversity within its neighborhoods, and I wonder how the more recent gentrification is changing the local identity of the city and the diversity of its neighborhoods.
Sure. I think the history and character of a place is not just reflected in the built landscape, right? It's not just about things and buildings. It's about people and activities, and it's culture, and it's this, it's the cultural environment and the built environment together, and the natural environment, your parks and open spaces, and is what, while I'm on it, as well as the economic environment. One of the things that I miss is seeing all the corner retail. So many corner retail. You see their houses now, but you can see that they used to be. That house on the corner used to be a market of some sort. There used to be economic activity, and so this kind of diversity of economic activity, of people, of buildings, this general diversity, we need to make definitely a conscious effort to maintain it, because otherwise kind of market forces in general will just kind of tend to go, to one direction. So I think the challenge, obviously, and one thing at CRHRS that we're very interested in is maintaining affordable housing and adequate affordable housing stock to maintain the cultural diversity that contributes so importantly, that's inseparable from the heritage of the Hill. The street that I live on, those houses they're smaller. It's one of those half streets where the block was in that big map, it was one of those big blocks, and then because the block was so big, they had to cut it in half. And they built little small worker housing in there, and the only way that I could afford to live on the Hill was if I bought the smallest house in Capitol Hill. And so I bought a little 860 square foot house. But when it was built in 1912, that whole street was marketed specifically for African Americans. It was a little bit smaller, it wasn't big, huge houses like on the state streets like a Kentucky or a South Carolina or a North Carolina. And that was really something, not that common in 1912. There was no law at that time that prevented anybody from simply refusing to sell you a house because of the color of your skin. Fair housing, there was no such thing as a fair housing law. And so it took a long time for us to begin to put these things in place to at least begin to kind of affirmatively further, the law is called affirmatively furthering fair housing, and to allow us to maintain our diversity.
Well, and I think one thing too we can talk about gentrification, and there's obviously positive and negative things that you can say about that process, but one thing that I think often gets lost in that more political or economic discussion is that oftentimes it's at moments of gentrification or proposed gentrification that we also see a unification or a resurgence of a communal voice. And it's often in times where suddenly a neighborhood feels somehow threatened that the community in that neighborhood realizes that there's something there that they feel is going to be lost. And once you think it's going to be lost, you start to tell the story, often in a new and more vibrant way. Sometimes that leads to the process or what the gentrification plan looks like actually being changed to reflect some things being maintained or a community holding on to some of its memory in a tangible way. Other times, the process continues, but that story is now back in the public consciousness. And I think that's a really important part of this kind of local communal identity that we see throughout Washington's history, in a really unique sort of way, partly just because we have this dual identity that's a constant tension, right?
Hello, my name is Kenny Diggs, representative of Eagles Nest Youth Association. We're a grassroots youth development org in Ward 8. Just like Miss Brenda, I'm native Washingtonian. I'm impressed by the energy in the room, the presence. And as we speak on historical values and the preservation of, that really means nothing without investment in youth, vision, innovation. And that's where I'm speaking from, and I'm representative of Ward 8. How can we support initiatives, programs, youth, who can also in turn push that legacy, support the historical value and preservation and the respect of history, right? And I look in the room and it's beautiful, the diversity here, but we gotta get out in the community. And we have to identify those who are doing the work in the community. I'm 15 years in with DPR, Department of Parks and Recreation. I've traveled all over the world extensively. I've got 3 boys of my own, 2 in college, 1 about to go. And maybe 65 young men out of Ward 8 who've all gone on to college, various careers. We've operated for the past 15 years unfunded, out of pocket. Eagles Nest Youth Association. We have the largest at-risk youth anti-violence initiative in the city, Shoot Hoops Not Bullets, 9 summers in a row, where we engage over 600 at-risk youth. That's powerful. So, my challenge and my question, how can we support and engage at a level where those youth can also become a part of this movement?
You know, I don't know that I'm the best person to speak to this, but just a couple of answers, I think. So one way to engage at least these types of questions is by having exactly these types of events, right? You know, I know that when Jay and I and some others that were working on planning these events and building up a bibliography and programs for them, you know, one of the things that we kept coming back to as a discussion topic was, what sort of people are going to show up to these events? And are they going to be asking the types of questions that you just did? But the fact is, you just did ask that question, and you did show up to this event. And so I think that engaging in creating this sort of platform for talking about these questions is one way that we can do that. The second thing I would say, I mean, this is just my own personal experience as an employee of the University of the District of Columbia, and in particular, the University of the District of Columbia's community college. That's what we're doing every day, right? I mean, that's what my institution is busy at work trying to accomplish on a daily basis. Do I think that there's other avenues and other ways that we can reach out to these people, you know, the people that you're bringing up, and that we can try to build greater connection? Absolutely. But it's there. We just need to continue to work in venues like this to make sure that we're all sort of working on building more resources in this sense.
I think, just to add briefly, that it's similar to what I said just a few minutes ago, is that we have to invest in more than just buildings. We have to invest in people, but to get that investment in people, we need to tell that story better about how people are connected to place and how critical they are to place, and that a place isn't just a clean, pretty street. It's filled with people, And you need to empower people in order to have a great place. And that's what we need to invest in. But I think we need to make that, demonstrate to folks how they're going to get a bigger return on their investment by investing in people and not just buildings.
Mr. Diggs, I want to commend you for the work that you do. I know how important that is. I want to add, just from my experience in organizing for the Heritage Trails, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, our community groups came together, and they weren't community groups yet, and we bonded over history. And that happens with the youth as well. And if you are able to have the youth get involved and engaged in the community programs that exist that connect them to the seniors, you go a long way towards building the respect for community that you're trying to do. I have spent some time at the Congress Heights senior facility and spoken there and met with the residents. I've done a fair amount of work in Ward 8, actually, and it is striking to me how committed that the longtime residents are of that community, generally, Southeast, Ward 8, all of it, a little bit of Southwest over there in Bellevue. And people have been there for many generations. They have inherently important stories to tell, and when they can connect with the youth and start telling those stories, because the youth are tasked with, pardon the expression, because the youth are told to go out and do an oral history with a senior, magical things can happen. It's a very practical way of dealing with this, but it does help to build community. And also, just for me personally, as I said, the Heritage Trails began as a way to get tourists off the mall into the neighborhoods, but what they very quickly turned into was a way to build respect for place. And that's just a small model that can be used by any number of organizations. So thank you for what you're doing.
I want to segue, before I take the next question, I want to segue by plugging our own program. Humanities DC has something called Soul of the City, which is both a grant program and a program. Alex Bain is one of our former directors of that program in the audience. But Soul of the City is exactly that. It's an oral history program by and large where young people are connected with old people and they conduct historical research based on interviews with those folks. So we do that. And if you all want to become a part of that, again, we offer a grants program for folks who want to do their own Soul of the City programs.
So hopefully I have a pretty easy one here. When people think of Washington, D.C.'s history, heritage, and culture, and this could be for anybody and anybody in the audience as well, what are the things that they think about outside of those things related to the federal government? And what are the things that you all think they should think about outside of the federal government?
If I could just, one thing that I'd like to add to that, or maybe just another way of reframing the question, because it was the question that I was most dying to ask the audience, is, when you talk, as residents of Washington, when you talk to people about the city, what do you focus on, right? I mean, what do you tell people who are not residents of the District of Columbia? What do you talk to them about when you're telling them about what it's like to live in Washington, D.C.? I think that's a very related question, or maybe just another way of asking the same question. That's for you guys out there.
Good evening, my name is Tiffany, and I'm a Washingtonian. What I think of when I think of my originality in D.C., I think of salad bowl, one of distinctive flavors and colors that describe the diversity of our city. And despite the changes, some are good and some are not so good. But I really see that we're coming together, more as a nation of people than someone divided. And I hope that we continue to strive towards that direction, no matter what political force or any at the Hill or outside the Hill. It starts right here in our hearts.
Hi, I'm Perry Franklin. I've lived in D.C. for 43 years. And like that? Oh yeah, I've lived here for 43 years. And one of the things that I think about and that I hope people are thinking about when they talk about Washington today is the magnificent public art that we have.
Hi, I'm Ann. I've lived in DC off and on since 1989. And I often tell people when I say I live in DC and I say I live in the city, and then I talk about how DC has a lot of very strong neighborhoods and very bonded neighborhoods. Like I live in Mount Pleasant, and there are a couple streets in Mount Pleasant that have parties every year. People actually know each other. And that DC also, I do mention there's a lot of free events that you can go to with very interesting discussions, and that there's always this really great energy around DC. That's what I tell people.
Sure. A brief comment back to perception and kind of reality, and I can't comment on the perception of folks on the outside looking in, but on the inside, because our little street gets together so routinely, and not only do we get to know everyone's kids' names and their dogs' names and their cats' names, but also what they do and who they work for. And I would say on my street, probably more than half, maybe 2/3 of the folks are at least 2 degrees of separation from government. They either work for government or work for somebody who works for government, or they work for somebody who engages government, and so government still is a very large aspect of, at least in Capitol Hill, maybe it's, just the locational proximity of being so close to the hub. But I think there is we're all just a few degrees of separation from government. I work for the federal government, so.
I just wanted to add something to that. So I live basically at First and E in Southeast. And, I live very close to Duddington, if anybody has ever walked past or through Duddington Street. And every summer there's a Duddington Block Festival. And I've been going to it for the 3-4 years that I've lived on E Street. And, it was this summer that we had this, that one of my neighbors who's been there for, I have no idea how long, my immediate neighbor, by the way, a woman by the name of Rose Ham, has been living next door to me in that house for 70 years. So she obviously has seen a very different Capitol Hill than what it looks like right now. But this neighbor of mine said, the Duddington Block Party has been going on since, I forget exactly what year he said, but it was something like 1972. That is obviously the preservation of a tradition that started at a point in time in which Capitol Hill was very different from what it is right now. But that is something that is carried over to this current, form and group of people that are living there. So I do think that we have this sort of traditional base.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Jessica Rucker. I'm a 3rd generation Washingtonian from my maternal side, 4th generation Washingtonian on my dad's side. And so when I think about DC, I think about a different city. So I think about the indigenous people who were here, who settled along what is now known as the Anacostia River, who were here before British colonizers were here. I think about in the 1800s, the Pearl Incident, so the group of organized black people who escaped chattel slavery here in Washington, D.C. Then I think about D.C. emancipation, right? The only in the first place in the history of the United States where people who enslaved Africans were compensated to no longer enslave people. I think about D.C. and home rule, right? And how for generations there were people who lived in a city where they weren't legally allowed to vote for the President of the United States. That changed as recently as 1964, right? But then I also think about Go-Go, which has helped narrate my lifetime, which is a really big part of my experience as a Washingtonian. I think about mumbo sauce and the cultural significance of that particular delicacy. And I mean this very seriously, right? And then I think about my great-grandmother who actually migrated to Washington, D.C. in the 1940s to escape the political and economic ramifications of a legacy of Jim Crow. And so that's what I think about. But then I also think about how the federal government kind of has helped to sanction, federal and local government, some of the demographic shifts that are making it hard for people like me to tell all these different stories about Washington, D.C.
You know, I really appreciate that list of things that you just gave with such passion. One of the things that I do, I teach at Catholic University of America, and we have a class there that's specifically designed about Washington. And on the first day of class, the students come in and we have them all have a little index card, and we say, what is Washington, D.C.? And 99% of these cards have something about the federal government or the National Mall or museums on it. That's what they think of when they're not from this area and they've come to college in DC and they're freshmen and they're thinking DC is that. And on the last day of class, we ask them the same question and give them another card. And it is beautiful to see that suddenly to them DC is people, DC is stories, DC is all of these different neighborhoods and communities and all of these historical events and all of these challenges and growth and opportunities. And we give them that back on the day of the final exam with their first answer. And it's so interesting to let them understand that by spending the semester studying DC and going out and exploring these different neighborhoods and different museums, and we bring in speakers from all sorts of different jobs and opportunities throughout the district to help them see the beautiful tapestry of DC that those of us who live here see every day.
Hello, my name is Alice Walker, and I am a native Washingtonian. My family has been in Washington since 1905. I can trace back my great-grandfather buying property in Georgetown in 1920, 3 houses and a store. We just sold the store at Wisconsin and O last year. We attend Mount Zion United Methodist. It's a church that's 200 years old. It is the oldest Black Methodist church in the city. We broke away from Dumbarton Methodist Church when they asked the freedmen and the slaves, because at that time, some of the slave owners allowed their slaves to go to church. And we broke away from the church, from Dumbarton, when they asked the slaves and the freedmen to sit in the balcony. And that's how we formed the first Black church in Washington, D.C. Well, I might as well keep talking about it. At Wisconsin and O, at the store that we had, my aunt who graduated from Howard in about, I think she was in the 1930s, my aunt, and she did teach in a one-room school down south somewhere in Virginia. But I remember that she came back and she used to do hair in the upstairs, and my great-grandfather had a tailor shop and a shoe shine shop in the basement. But women who worked in houses of the rich people up Wisconsin Avenue would come down and transfer to go across town at O Street, Wisconsin and O. So she would catch the people who were going home, and she would do their hair on a Friday night before they went home. That's something I wanted to share. But in the Heritage Trail and in all of the history that's documented, I don't know that you're capturing that so much of Georgetown was Black, or that, and as I said, we're very proud. We're getting ready in 2016 celebrate 200 years. We've held down that community in Georgetown. We've made a difference in Georgetown. We have a daycare that we open up to the residents of Georgetown, and we keep it at which I don't like, but we keep it at a very minimum fee. But that's so that we feel that we're giving back to the community, even though it's very affluent. I just want to make sure that in all of the history that's being documented, that you don't forget that Georgetown was Black, and that it was, and we have a lot that we contributed, and we still contribute today to the city and to that, well, we all contribute to the city, but that church contributes to the city and to the community. So, thank you.
Ms. Walker, thank you for adding your story. A little side note here. I'm very familiar with Mount Zion and the story of the church and the story of the African American community in Georgetown. Beginning with the book Black Georgetown Remembered, which is about to be reissued, and everybody needs to get a copy of it if you haven't read it already. As far as the heritage trails are concerned, I just want to let you know we tried very hard to put a heritage trail in Georgetown. We were told you can put a heritage trail in Georgetown, but it has to be only below M Street. And that was because the community didn't want the tourists peeking in their windows, because the big houses are right on the street. And that's a shorthand for they just didn't want this to go on. So as a former steward of the heritage trails, it was the one major disappointment that I had, was that we did not get to tell the story of Georgetown in the way that you just talked about it. I will note, though, that the gentrification that came to Georgetown in the 1930s with the New Deal moved a lot of people to other neighborhoods, as you well know, many of whom still come back to Mount Zion. And when we encountered those stories in other neighborhoods, such as Deanwood or Barracks Row area or Brightwood, we noted that on the heritage trails. We talked about families, and we noted that they had their roots in the African American part of Georgetown. So thank you for bringing that up, and I hope one day we'll change their minds.
And if I could make another...
The subway's a whole other issue.
If I could make one plug based on what you just said, on February 24th, Black Georgetown Remembered is going to be reissued. There'll be an event at Georgetown University. They're going to show a film, they're going to re-release the book, and the rumor is Michelle Obama will be there.
And the rumor is that they're sold out, too, so you better check on it.
Thank you. My name is Tia Thompson. I'm originally from South Florida. I'm a part of the creative community here in DC. I'm a storyteller. I use photography. When I came to DC, I have an older brother that's been in DC for about more than 20 years. We're from a small beach town in South Florida. And my first visit to DC, I was about 10 or 11 years old. And the thing that I loved about seeing in DC was seeing so many different kinds of Black people thrive in the city, whether they were professionals on the Hill, whether they were working downtown, whether they were working for DC government, or street artists. I was in love. And so at the age of 10, that mattered. And here at the age of 33, when I moved to DC in about 2009, that still matters. And as an artist that's, a part of the community here, what is your vision for art in DC, particularly around Blackness, and artists that are in DC, working and from DC?
Well,
Thank
I'll
you.
start with a personal observation on that. That's a wonderful question to ask. The history of Washington, the local city, as well as Washington, the capital, is so rooted in African American culture that you can't even talk about the arts of Washington or the theater or the music without acknowledging and respecting the African American roots of it. So as a blanket statement, as somebody who's not an artist but a historian, but very respectful of what you do, I think there's just no question that Washington is a very important capital of African American culture, always has been. And there's so much to be said here about the interaction of various groups of people that creates art. I'm glad you came to town.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm also in no position to comment on the future of the arts in DC, but since we're sitting up here, I think, as Jane said, it's inseparable. If you want to reflect the district, you can't. It's impossible to do so without reflecting its Blackness, as you said, and I think any. I don't know, any any initiative going down that route will just certainly focus on that.
You know, I'm not an artist, so I don't know that I can speak to it. But I will say, as somebody, you know, my status here is a transplant. You know, this is such an incredibly diverse city compared to many cities that one can be from. This is much more diverse than Chicago, despite the fact of the presence of numerous ethnic neighborhoods. But I do think that one area that DC really does need to work on is the presence of its sort of local art opportunities. You know, we may have the Smithsonian, and we may have museums that highlight all forms of art on this sort of national scale. But I would also say that as a Chicagoan, the number of art gallery openings that I might go to on an average week, if I so chose to do so, or small-scale gallery showings, was much greater than what I think we find in DC. And I think that's unfortunate, given the presence not only of the arts here, but also the diversity of the arts here. So I do think it's a concern and maybe something that needs to be pushed to the forefront as not really being represented powerfully enough here in this city.
I just wanted to add to my previous comment, bring in the public art that we do have all over the city, and to hook it into the theme of this, which is that it has done so much to build community. The making of the art is a community process, and but also to represent what the community has meant to the people, what it does mean to the people, and to not just represent history, but it makes history too. So there is something going on here that's very, very important.
My name is Clarence Miles, and I'm a Washingtonian. And I was just sitting here just thinking, and I was just listening to the panel and the people stating, I guess, their mind or what they see as now. And I'm kind of like reflecting back to yesterday. You know, I grew up on Capitol Hill, and I'm trying to figure out, because they keep expanding the name Capitol Hill to different parts of Capitol Hill. I know where it starts, and I'm 58 years old, and the area that I grew up in is off of 8th Street. But then I keep hearing it keep expanding. So one of the questions I want to know is, where do Capitol Hill stops?
What did you call your neighborhood when you grew up in it?
Well, my neighborhood still is the same.
Yeah.
Where I grew up at.
What's the name of your neighborhood?
I grew up on 8th Street.
So you called it 8th Street?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So where does Capitol Hill stop?
Yeah.
You know, part of this is real estate and marketing, right? You know, if I can call this Capitol Hill, that increases property value, but I'll leave it to people who know the neighborhoods longer and better than I. You're the expert.
No, I'm not. In fact, I don't think there needs to be a boundary, or necessarily should there be a line in the sand of what constitutes Capitol Hill. I think it's about how you relate to a place, and if that goes all the way up to Florida Ave, then it goes up to Florida Ave, you know, and
Fairfax Village. Yeah, I'm going to just add one other thing too. To this issue, and it's totally going to be wimping out, all right? When we were doing the heritage trails, including the 8th Street Heritage Trail, in the community meetings, the first question was, whose history are you going to tell? And the second question was, what are the boundaries of this heritage trail neighborhood we're going to talk about? We never said these are the boundaries. We said we are looking for the heart of the neighborhood. And that's where we're going to put the trail, with the understanding that the neighborhood name extends beyond those particular signs. So were we wimping out? Absolutely. But the reality is, with the real estate industry the way it is, the neighborhood boundaries change all the time. If you look at what the city does, if you go to the city maps, for years they would not draw the boundaries of a neighborhood either, because it was personal. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep the names of our neighborhoods alive and out there. I mean, it used to drive me crazy that the Washington Post would talk about Anacostia. Everything east of the river was Anacostia, right? Today they talk about Southeast. Hello, how many neighborhoods do we have in Southeast that are called Southeast? None of them. We have neighborhood names. Let's use them.
One of the things, and the reason why I asked that question, because we're talking about real estate, and we're talking about people buying into community, but basically buying into the name of what they think that is that community. And with me being a Washingtonian, I know for a fact that if I was to come into my community where I live at and tell the people that I live in Capitol Hill now, which I've been on 8th Street all my life, they would look at me like I'm crazy. But when you bring new people through the community, they don't know the difference, so they'll buy into the project. And with the project will ease the other person that's been there a long time, ease them out, because they think that they really living in a very historical place that's right off from the Capitol, which that is a beautiful place. But down by Union Station, what they're looking for is convenient to transportation to get back and forth in the area that they want to call Capitol Hill. And when you say that there is no boundaries, it may not be any boundary, because when you're talking about financial, and you're talking about building, you're talking about historical avenues where people who just come in town to move in, it may seem like it's a very nice place because they see the new construction that are around them same areas that they want to call Capitol Hill. So I just wanted to say that myself.
And this is one of the problems of, I hate using the term gentrification because I think it can be used a lot of different ways and it can be code for a lot of different things. But to go back to a point that we were talking about earlier, one of the problems of change is that, you have people who are new to the neighborhood who are buying a house, a place in this neighborhood because they're it's been sold to them as this. And in doing so, they're trying to re-identify your neighborhood with something that's always been something else to you in a different way. And that's part of, what comes with struggle and as people start changing neighborhoods and new people are moving in. This is part of the process that goes through when new people are moving in. It's difficult.
I really appreciate your comments and your perspective. I think the nature of what I was getting at is that I think oftentimes boundaries can kind of foster a sense of otherness or exclusion, and I'm in or I'm out. I'm on this side or I'm on that side, and when it comes to boundaries are necessary for planning purposes and census tracts and planning districts and this and that, but when it comes to cultural identity, it's the same reason why the Census Bureau now lets you check multiple boxes for race. I don't fit in any one box. I'm not here or there. I'm in multiple places, and there are a multitude of ways of relating to where you are and what that means. And so it's a little bit of this fluid, fuzzy thing. It's messy.
My name is Monty Edwards, and like Scott, I'm also with the Capitol Hill Restoration Society. I wanted to point out that while the northern boundary of the Capitol Hill Historic District, for purpose of how you restore your house, is F Street. However, if you look at the Capitol Hill Restoration Society bylaws, our area of interest extends all the way to Florida Avenue. So we recognize, as Scott described, it is a community, whereas there may be specific boundaries for historic preservation considerations. Thank you.
All right, we'll let that be the last comment. Thank you all very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Humanitini in March.